Have you ever walked away from a conversation replaying everything you said, wondering where it went wrong, wondering why you gave so much and still felt invisible? You showed interest. You were present. You tried to say the right things. And somehow, it still wasn't enough. Not just with her, but with people in general. Friends, co-workers, rooms where you felt like you existed, but didn't land. And here's the uncomfortable truth most men never hear. It's not because you lack value. It's because somewhere along the way, you were taught to trade your value for approval. And the moment you start performing for acceptance, you quietly give away the one thing that makes people feel you in the first place, your grounded presence. This isn't about becoming colder, louder, or harder to read. This is about something far more dangerous and far more powerful. Learning how to stand so firmly in who you are that attention stops being something you chase and starts becoming something you attract without asking. If this hook works for you, I'll continue directly into section 1 and build the momentum from there. Most men don't realize they're trapped because the cage looks normal. It looks like effort, like being attentive, like responding fast, explaining yourself clearly, trying to be understood. From the outside, it looks responsible, even admirable. But underneath, it is a quiet dependence that drains your presence before you ever speak. You're not talking to express who you are. You're talking to see how you're received. And that shift changes everything. We live in a world that trains men to seek constant feedback. Likes, replies, reactions, validation in real time. If there's no response, the mind fills the silence with doubt. Did I say too much? Not enough? Should I follow up? Should I clarify? And slowly, without noticing, your sense of worth starts syncing itself to external signals. Approval becomes the metric. Attention becomes proof. And without it, you feel unsettled, restless, incomplete. Here's what no one tells you. The more you need validation, the more you leak it. People feel it before they can explain it. They sense when your energy is waiting on a reaction instead of rooted in certainty. And once your presence depends on being received well, you stop leading the interaction and start orbiting it. You adjust your tone. You soften your edges. You offer more than necessary just to stay relevant. And the irony is brutal. The harder you try to connect, the easier you are to overlook. This isn't a flaw in your character. It's a survival pattern that once kept you safe. Belonging mattered. Being liked meant security. But in adulthood, that same pattern becomes a liability. Because attraction, respect, and influence don't grow from emotional hunger. They grow from self-containment. From someone who can enter a space hole, not hoping to be completed by how others respond. And this is where most men get stuck. They think the solution is better words, better timing, better strategies. But the real problem lives deeper. It's the belief that being understood is more important than being grounded. And as long as that belief runs the interaction, everything you say will feel like a request, even when it sounds confident. What happens next is where things begin to shift, because once you see how validation quietly steals your power, you start to understand why effort alone has never been enough. Trying hard feels like the right move. You show interest. You lean in. You give more. On the surface, it looks like commitment, maturity, even confidence. But psychologically, something else is being communicated. And it has nothing to do with effort itself. It has everything to do with where that effort is coming from. Human beings are wired to read emotional balance before words. Long before someone processes what you're saying, they register how centered you are while saying it. When effort is driven by self-trust, it feels solid. When effort is driven by fear of losing attention, it feels unstable. And instability, even subtle, triggers distance. Not because the other person is cruel or manipulative, but because the nervous system naturally pulls away from what feels emotionally dependent. This is where most men misunderstand attraction and respect. They assume giving more creates closeness. But closeness doesn't come from intensity. It comes from safety. And safety isn't created by someone who is trying to secure a reaction. It's created by someone who could lose the interaction and remain unchanged. That quiet self-sufficiency is what relaxes the other person's guard. Not charm, not persuasion, not effort. Here's the part nobody talks about. Overgiving doesn't signal generosity. It often signals anxiety. Explaining too much doesn't show clarity. It shows a need to be agreed with. Constant availability doesn't show loyalty. It shows a lack of internal structure. And once someone senses that your emotional state is tied to how they respond, the dynamic shifts. Without intending to, they step into the position of authority. Not because they want control, but because you handed it to them. And this isn't about blaming women, society, or culture. It's about understanding cause and effect. When one person needs the outcome more than the other, the balance tilts. Desire fades. Respect thins. The interaction loses tension, not in a dramatic way, but in a slow, almost invisible collapse where nothing feels wrong, yet nothing feels alive. Most men never see this happening. They just feel the distance grow. Replies slow down. Energy changes. Conversations lose depth. And instead of pulling inward and stabilizing, they push harder. More words, more reassurance, more effort, which only confirms the very thing that caused the shift in the first place. The breakthrough isn't in trying less. It's in needing less. And once you understand that difference, you stop fighting human psychology and start working with it. Because the moment your effort is no longer trying to secure value, but expressing it, the entire dynamic begins to reorganize itself around you. Power is rarely lost in a dramatic moment. It slips away quietly, in choices that feel harmless at the time. A sentence you soften so it lands better. An opinion you adjust to avoid tension. A boundary you explain twice because you're afraid of being misunderstood. None of it feels like weakness. It feels like emotional intelligence. But stacked together, these moments teach others something dangerous about you, that your center can be moved. The exact moment men lose power is when they begin editing themselves for comfort instead of standing in clarity. When being agreeable becomes more important than being aligned. When silence feels threatening, so you fill it. When discomfort arises, and instead of holding your ground, you rush to smooth it over. Not because you don't know who you are, but because you don't fully trust that who you are is enough without approval. What makes this costly is how invisible it is. You don't feel less confident immediately. You feel cooperative, reasonable, easy to be around. But internally, something fractures. You start watching reactions more than your own values. You start measuring yourself through response instead of self-respect. And the more you do that, the more your presence shifts from grounded to negotiable. People don't consciously think, I can control him now. They just feel it. They feel that you're open to being persuaded, adjusted, redirected. And once that feeling is there, tension disappears. Not because they dislike you, but because there's nothing left to push against. Nothing firm to lean on. Attraction, respect, and influence all need resistance. Not conflict, but structure. This is why over-explaining is so destructive. The more you justify, the more you imply your stance needs permission. The more you defend, the more you signal doubt. And doubt is contagious. Once others sense it, they stop investing emotionally. They don't lean in. They don't wonder. They don't test. They simply observe, knowing you'll move if pressure is applied. The tragedy is that most men interpret this shift as rejection. They think they weren't interesting enough, confident enough, impressive enough. But the truth is harder and more empowering. You weren't rejected, you were felt. And what was felt was someone slowly stepping away from himself to maintain connection. The moment you notice this pattern, everything changes. Because power doesn't return through dominance or withdrawal. It returns the moment you stop abandoning your own position. And that's where the real shift begins, not in what you say next, but in what you no longer feel the need to explain. Most men misunderstand calm. They think it means being emotionally distant, hard to read, or unaffected. So they try to act calm while everything inside them is tight, reactive, and restless. But real calm isn't a performance. It's a byproduct of self-trust. And without that foundation, silence feels forced and restraint feels like suppression. True calm comes from knowing you'll be okay no matter how the interaction unfolds. It's the internal certainty that if someone pulls away, disagrees, or misunderstands you, your sense of self doesn't collapse. You don't rush to fix the moment. You don't scramble for reassurance. You stay where you are mentally and emotionally. And that steadiness communicates more than any perfectly chosen words ever could. The nervous system picks this up instantly. People can feel when you're waiting for a reaction versus when you're simply present. They feel when your attention is anchored internally instead of leaning outward, hoping to be met. And that grounded energy creates a subtle shift. Conversations slow down. Silences stop feeling awkward. Your words start landing with weight because they're not rushed out of fear. Calm doesn't mean you care less. It means you're no longer bargaining with your emotions. You're not trying to control outcomes. You're not trying to be impressive. You're allowing things to unfold without attaching your worth to the result. And paradoxically, that's what makes others lean in. Because calm signals safety, and safety creates space for real connection. This is why emotional reactivity kills attraction and respect so quickly. Reactivity tells people your inner world is unstable, easily moved, easily shaken. Calm tells them the opposite. It says you have an internal structure strong enough to hold pressure without cracking. And that's rare in a world where most people are overstimulated, impatient, and constantly seeking validation. Here's the shift most men miss. Calm isn't something you do in the moment. It's something you build long before the interaction ever happens. It's built through keeping promises to yourself, choosing discomfort over avoidance, and learning to sit with uncertainty without needing to escape it. When you do that, calm becomes natural, effortless, unforced. And when calm is real, not rehearsed, it changes how people respond to you. They listen differently. They test less. They respect more. Not because you demanded it, but because your presence quietly shows that you don't need anything from them to remain whole. And that level of self-trust is where everything begins to turn. Everything changes when you decide who you are before you walk into the room. Most men do the opposite. They enter interactions empty, waiting to be shaped by reactions, approval, or resistance. They listen not to understand, but to adjust. And without realizing it, they hand their identity to whoever responds the strongest. Identity, before interaction, means your values are already set. Your standards are already defined. Your sense of worth isn't up for negotiation. So when you speak, you're not checking faces for permission. When you pause, you're not afraid of silence. You're not trying to win the moment. You're observing it. And that alone shifts the entire dynamic. This is where true confidence is born. Not from charm or social dominance, but from internal alignment. When your words match your actions, and your actions match your principles, you stop leaking energy. There's no internal conflict, no mental scrambling, no second-guessing after the fact. You leave interactions feeling clean, not drained, because you didn't betray yourself to maintain connection. Most men never experience this because they've never clarified what they stand for. They react instead of decide. They bend instead of choose. And when you don't choose yourself first, someone else will always choose for you. That's how men end up chasing validation they don't even respect. Here's the quiet truth. When you don't need the interaction to define you, you become selective without being arrogant. You listen differently. You notice red flags instead of ignoring them. You speak honestly without sharpening your tone. And suddenly, the interaction stops being about whether you're enough and starts becoming about whether it aligns. This is the first real power shift. You're no longer entering conversations to be chosen. You're entering them to see if they fit your life, your values, your direction. And that mindset alone creates a presence most people can't explain, but immediately feel. Because certainty doesn't announce itself. It settles into the room and lets everything else respond to it. Mystery has been misunderstood and abused. Most people think it means withholding, playing hard to get, or acting uninterested to provoke a reaction. That isn't mystery. That's manipulation. Real mystery doesn't come from hiding yourself. It comes from being complete enough that you don't feel compelled to reveal everything at once. When you overshare too early, over-explain your emotions, or rush to make yourself fully understood, you collapse all depth into immediacy. There's nothing left to discover. Not because you lack substance, but because you gave it away before it was earned. And the human mind doesn't value what it doesn't have to engage with. Mystery, without games, is emotional containment. It's knowing what you feel without outsourcing the responsibility for those feelings. It's allowing space between thought and expression, not suppression, precision. You speak when there's alignment, not urgency. And that restraint creates gravity, because people lean toward what isn't constantly reaching outward. This is especially important in a culture that rewards oversharing. Men are told to lay everything on the table, to be emotionally available at all times, to prove sincerity through exposure. But exposure without structure creates fragility. When every emotion is immediately expressed, there's no depth, only reaction. And reaction is predictable. The man who carries mystery isn't silent because he's afraid. He's silent because he's selective. He doesn't rush to fill space just to stay relevant. He allows others to sit with uncertainty without rescuing them from it. And in that space, curiosity grows. Not anxiety, but interest. Because there's something stable there that hasn't been fully mapped. This is why predictability kills attraction faster than conflict ever could. Once someone believes they've figured you out completely, how you'll react, what you'll say, where your emotional limits are, the tension dissolves. You're no longer experienced. You're anticipated. And anticipation without variation becomes boredom. Mystery without games means you are present, consistent, and emotionally grounded, but not consumable. Your time has shape. Your energy has boundaries. Your inner world isn't handed out freely just to create closeness. And that restraint isn't about control. It's about self-respect. Because what carries weight must be held, not scattered. Most men don't struggle with confidence. They struggle with intention. They speak to fill space, to manage reactions, to avoid discomfort. Words become a defense mechanism instead of an expression of clarity. And when speech is driven by fear, fear of silence, fear of disapproval, fear of being forgotten, it loses authority no matter how confident it sounds. Speaking with intent means every word has a reason to exist. You're not talking to be liked. You're not talking to control the outcome. You're talking because what you're saying aligns with who you are. And that alignment is felt immediately. People listen differently when they sense you're not negotiating your truth in exchange for acceptance. Authority doesn't come from volume, speed, or clever phrasing. It comes from restraint, from pauses that aren't awkward because they're deliberate, from sentences that don't need follow-up explanations because they're rooted in conviction. When you speak this way, your voice slows, your tone settles. And suddenly, you don't need to emphasize anything. The weight is already there. This is why over-explaining weakens communication. The more you justify your position, the more you imply it isn't solid on its own. The more you defend, the more you invite challenge. And the moment your speech becomes reactive, you lose the frame. Not because you were wrong, but because you stop standing. Speaking with intent also means being comfortable with being misunderstood in the short term. Clarity doesn't always land immediately. Sometimes it creates friction. Sometimes it creates silence. But those moments filter out dynamics built on performance instead of respect. The people who stay lean in. The people who don't were never aligned to begin with. When your words come from intent instead of outcome, you stop chasing reactions. You observe them. You adjust your direction, not your identity. And that shift changes everything. Conversations become cleaner. Boundaries become easier. You stop leaving interactions replaying what you should have said, because you already said what mattered. And here's the quiet power of it all. When your speech reflects self-respect, others feel permission to respect you too. Not because you demanded it, but because you modeled it. Authority isn't announced. It's demonstrated in how little you need to say to remain grounded. And once you learn to speak from that place, your presence becomes impossible to dismiss, even when your voice is calm. The real shift doesn't happen in grand gestures. It happens quietly, in the subtle flip of who is leading and who is chasing. Most men think influence is earned through effort, charm, or persuasion. But true power lives in presence. It's in the internal stance you hold before anyone acknowledges it. And once that stance is solid, the dynamic changes, without a single word being forced. This is the moment nobody talks about. You stop measuring yourself against others' reactions. You stop performing for attention. Your approval becomes unnecessary, your emotions contained, your decisions aligned with your values instead of their expectations. And suddenly, the energy around you shifts. People start noticing, not because you've done more, not because you're louder or flashier. They notice because you exist differently. Here's the critical part. The shift is invisible at first. You'll feel it as subtle respect instead of overt validation. Conversations no longer pull you in, they orbit around you. Your words land with weight because they come from truth, not insecurity. Your presence holds tension without effort. And people lean in naturally, curious, drawn, unsettled in a way that commands attention. It's the rare energy few possess because few have earned it. Most give their power away in the pursuit of being liked. They negotiate their values, bend their standards, chase reactions. But the man who stops chasing, who stops explaining, who stops performing, he flips the script. Suddenly, others wonder if they're enough for him. Suddenly, they adjust to his rhythm. Suddenly, influence comes to him instead of being pushed. And here's the secret many miss. It isn't about manipulation. It's not tricks or games. It's about self-possession, about living in alignment, speaking with intent, holding mystery without distance, trusting yourself before engagement, and moving through interactions from principle instead of fear. Once you embody that, the world reacts, not because you demand it, but because your presence quietly forces it. This is the pinnacle of transformation. Not recognition, not applause, not victory over others, but mastery over yourself. And when that internal power aligns with every action, every word, every pause, everything shifts. You are no longer chasing. You are leading. You are no longer reacting. You are the standard. And once you reach that point, everything, respect, desire, influence, follows naturally. It all comes down to one simple truth. Nothing outside you defines your worth. Influence, respect, desire, they flow naturally when you stop chasing, stop performing, and start living from principle. The energy that makes people lean in, the presence that leaves an impression, the authority that can't be challenged, they all begin inside, long before anyone notices. You don't need tricks. You don't need approval. You don't need validation to feel seen. You need clarity. You need self-trust. You need the courage to stand before the world fully aligned with your values, letting interactions test, not shape you. That's where change starts, not in clever words or fleeting tactics, but in the way you hold yourself when no one is watching. Today, decide that you will step into that space. Choose presence over performance. Choose principle over reaction. Choose yourself first, and everything else aligns naturally. Practice calm when the world pressures you. Speak with intent when distraction surrounds you. Preserve mystery without pretending. And notice how relationships, opportunities, and respect begin to follow, not because you demanded it, but because you embodied it. The power shift is quiet, subtle, almost invisible. But once it happens, it's undeniable. You will no longer bend for attention. You will no longer negotiate your worth. You will no longer wait to be chosen. And in that clarity, you will finally understand the only approval that matters is your own. Stand in that truth. Carry it forward. Let your presence speak louder than any words ever could. Your time, your energy, your life, it's yours to command. And when you own it fully, the world responds naturally, effortlessly, and without compromise.